Going, everyone.
Good, welcome. Thanks for joining.
Hey, Chris.
Hey.
Hey, Marianne.
Nice to not see you. I don't see you yet. I was gonna. Nice to see you.
Starting off with a little shade there. So now we have all of our panelists. I'm going to go ahead and jump into introductions. My name is Jan Michael Archer. I'm a PhD student at the Community Engagement, Environmental Justice, and Health Laboratory at the University of Maryland School of Public Health. And thanks for joining in on this session about federal and state EJ legislation. We're joined by a fantastic group of panelists that I am excited to introduce. So starting with Marianne Engelman-Lado, who is currently a visiting professor at the Douglas Cossell Chair, the Douglas Cossell Chair in Environmental Law at Vermont Law School, where she is directing an environmental justice clinic focusing on civil rights enforcement in the environmental justice context. She also serves as a lecturer at both the Yale University School of Public Health and Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, where she supervises interdisciplinary teams of law, environmental, and public health students. Next, we have Celina Scott-Buechler, whose interests lie at the intersection of climate change mitigation, ecosystem sustainability, and social equity, both nationally and internationally. She has experience in government and nonprofit, as well as academic interdisciplinary research. Celina is a climate scientist and activist. As a UNHSI Sustainability Fellow, Celina had the privilege of working with Peace Rising, conducting research in distributed climate change impacts in U.S. foreign policy. She's compiled a report exposing how American foreign policy is ill-prepared to deal with the greatest humanitarian threat of our generation, which is, of course, climate change-driven violent conflict. Next, we have Chris Espinosa, who serves as the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer for Green Latinos. With nearly a decade of organizational management, federal public policy, coalition building, and advocacy experience in Washington, D.C., he is a seasoned advocacy professional with a wealth of talent and tremendous asset to the Green Latinos team. With his bachelor's degree in business management, Chris assists Green Latinos in its internal organizational development and long-term strategic growth, and manages the organization's programmatic implementation and day-to-day operations. In addition to his recent role as legislative representative for Earth Justice, covering clean water, lead, and mountaintop removal mining policy and legislation, Chris has served as the senior legislative assistant to Representative Julia Brownley, the Democrat from California, covering a broad policy portfolio on behalf of the Congresswoman. Next, we have Dr. Nicky Sheats, who is currently the director of the Center for the Urban Environment at the John S. Watson Institute for Public Policy of Thomas Edison State College, where he has defined the primary mission of the center as providing support for New Jersey's environmental justice community. He has also been a member of the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, New Jersey's only statewide and environmental organization that focuses solely on environmental justice issues since its inception in 2003. Among the issues he is working on are particulate matter, air pollution, climate change, cumulative risk and impacts, developing environmental justice legal strategies, and increasing the capacity of the EJ community to address these and other issues. And finally, we have Veronica Eady, who serves as the Deputy Executive Officer and is the primary internal and external contact for the Air District on environmental justice matters, and will be providing leadership of the district's community engagement, diversity, equity, and inclusion program and policy work. Ms. Eady previously served as the Assistant Executive Officer for Environmental Justice at the California Air Resources Board, where she oversaw their environmental justice activities. Ms. Eady formerly served as the Vice President and Director of Conservation Law Foundation, Massachusetts, and was the Associate General Counsel and Director of Environmental Justice at New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, a nonprofit civil rights law firm in New York City. So welcome, panelists. Of course, we don't always have, with the online format, you won't hear all of the applause, but I assure you it is there. Just to get us rolling, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to discuss these federal and state level EJ legislations with us today. Before we get started, I want to know a little bit more about your backgrounds and what brought you to environmental and EJ policymaking. So let's start with Marianne. And roughly 1 to 2 minutes each.
Thanks so much for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'm looking at the names, and there are so many that are familiar who could, instead of me, certainly could be on this panel, and I'm sure I would learn a lot. So I look forward to the Q&A. I'm currently directing the Environmental Justice Clinic at Vermont Law School, so moved from being temporary to really trying to dig in and move an environmental justice program forward. And we work with interdisciplinary groups of students at Vermont Law School and at Yale on environmental justice issues with a community lawyering focus. And what that means is we represent communities across the country on legislative and litigation and administrative and policy issues in the environmental justice and climate justice area. I mention that because I going into my background, I went to law school and began doing work on civil rights. And I bring a civil rights perspective to all that I do. I started at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and then had the opportunity as general counsel of New York Lawyers of working with Veronica. And over the course of that time, I moved from working on civil rights more generally, racial disparities in access to healthcare, racial disparities in education, to working with EJ communities during the growth of the environmental justice movement, and wound up spending more and more of my time really getting to know communities across the country and wanting to rethink how we do our lawyering and providing support for the environmental justice movement and the many communities that were struggling to assert control over their environment and their future. So I've increasingly focused on environmental justice and climate justice, but bring that racial justice perspective to all that I and we do.
Thanks, Marianne. Nicky?
Well, I'll give you my background first. I started out as a public interest lawyer. When I graduated from law school, I clerked for a judge down in DC, and I was a legal services lawyer in the program that Reagan cut out. And I was a public defender. And then I worked for a legal education project in Harlem. So I was, for the most part, I was a trial lawyer representing people of color and poor people. Then I kind of took an odd turn. I went back to school and got a PhD in biological oceanography, something called stable isotope biogeochemistry. And that's when one day, in wandering around campus at Harvard, I came upon a environmental justice conference. I'd never heard of environmental justice. And what I remember is that there was a black man from EPA at the conference, and board community members were giving him a hard time. And I didn't know what was going on, but I got a reading list from them. I thought this was very interesting. And when I looked through the reading list, I thought, well, this brings together a lot of my interests: science. I also have a master's degree in public policy, science, law, and came up with the idea of starting an EJ course, typical academic. I knew nothing about EJ, but I was willing to help start a course. And that's kind of how I launched into environmental justice. And once I graduated from grad school, I came back to New Jersey for personal reasons, really. And soon we started the Environmental Justice, New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance. And have been, connected with it in some way. I work at Thomas Edison State University. I did a postdoc at Columbia University Earth Institute, but all those times I've been working with the Alliance. And I focused on air pollution, climate change, and cumulative impacts. And now my work is about, I don't know, 50% national, I guess, 50% local. I'm a member of 3 or 4 national EJ organizations also. And I guess it was all set up for me. I'm the oldest one on the panel. I grew up in the 60s, and that really, it put in me that I had to do something to help communities. And so that's kind of been the driving point for my entire career.
Excellent, thank you. We'll move on to Celina next.
Yeah, hi. So I think I'm the most junior person on the call. I started off working with We Act for Environmental Justice out in New York City. It was just kind of a summer gig, but it really kind of lit a fire. And so studied sort of the intersection of, I knew I was interested in climate change and kind of, ecosystems, and came to recognize the real intersections with racial justice and social justice. And so now I'm working in Senator Cory Booker's office. So we have a good New Jersey contingency here representing on the environmental justice and also some climate justice portfolio issues. And am hoping to continue that kind of work. Have also done some work on sort of global climate justice and looking at histories of colonialism. But I think ultimately my interests lie here at home because there's a lot of work to do. So I'm very happy to be on this panel, and so glad to see a number of names. And yeah, looking forward to talking. Thanks.
Thank you. Chris.
Sure. I'm happy to be on this call with everyone today. I sort of took a meandering route to environmental justice. I started with Hispanic civil rights advocacy, and that's where most of my professional background has been. And that sort of began when I was about 13 or 14, growing up in the city you see behind me, which is Santa Paula, California. The city is 70% Latino, but as I grew up, it became more and more clear to me that the city was structurally segregated, and there was a very clear Latino side of the town and not. And the services and infrastructure and support to one side of the town was completely disproportionate. So that's what drove me down a path of trying to figure out what was behind that. And, I focused largely on the policy dynamics and worked for a number of Hispanic civil rights advocacy institutions to address some of those things. And it was through that experience that sort of drew the connections for me between the issues that I had been working on: immigration, housing, healthcare, particularly for the Latino community, and issues of environmental inequity and injustice. And once that connection was clear to me, it became a passion pursuit. And I've tried to leverage every tool that I've had available to try and make progress on that front. And for the last 3 years, I've been privileged to work for Chairman Grijalva on the House Committee on Natural Resources, where he has undertaken a pretty comprehensive environmental justice initiative along with Representative McEachin and Senator Harris. So I feel blessed that I get to do the work that is important to me and impacts communities that deserve the kind of advocacy and representation in Congress to affect the kind of change that I think we all want to see.
Thank you. And finally, Miss Eady.
Yeah, sure. So thank you for having me here today. I now, as you mentioned, work for the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. So I'm here in the Bay Area. I grew up in rural Western Pennsylvania. I grew up in an area that is now Trump country, where there were almost no other people of color in my community. So as you can imagine, I grew up subjected to virulent racism on a daily basis as a child. And that meant that my parents were very involved in civil rights and exercising their franchise to change the community and make it a better place for their children. I moved out to California to go to college and then later to law school. And coming out of law school, I was hired by US EPA. And that was in the early 90s. And I remember in my first year or two at EPA, I read an article in Essence magazine about the Gulf Coast Tenants Association in Louisiana and about the work that they were doing, marrying civil rights and environmental law. And from that moment on, when I realized that I could combine my passion for the environment with civil rights, I took it upon myself to spend those 6 years that I was at EPA learning as much as I could about environmental law so that I could apply it in a community context. So I did spend many years working in the nonprofit world, working on behalf of communities of color and low-income communities, including as executive director for Alternatives for Community and Environment in Boston. But I went into state government because I found that that was a place where I could work internally to train my colleagues, to develop policy, and to develop partnerships with environmental justice groups. So I'm particularly happy to be at the Bay Area Air Quality Management District because this district has, for many years, had a number of challenges in working with EJ communities, including the fact that there are 5 massive refineries in the Bay Area. So you can imagine what some of the really profound environmental justice issues are. So I've been here for 2 months and looking forward to making some progress here in the Bay Area.
Thank you. Okay, so getting into it, kind of the first question that we had, we kind of sourced these questions from several other leaders in the field. And, you know, of course, as I think Chris mentioned, the work of Chairman Grijalva and Representative McEachin, you know, there's been a lot of stuff. There's been a lot of action recently at the federal stage for environmental justice legislation. So digging into that, on July 14th, Joe Biden released the Biden Plan to secure environmental justice and equitable economic opportunity in a clean energy future. Panelists, what were all of your first impressions of this plan? So I'll start with Chris.
Well, this is just my personal view. I want to make that clear. You know, I think that what I saw in the plan reflects many of the sentiments that we have heard through our public inputting process on the Environmental Justice for All Act. I think the plan that I saw lays out some key tenets of the EJ for All Act policy. Including, you know, strengthening agency accountability and coordination so that there's a unified response and strategy to addressing environmental justice, ensuring that communities have public input opportunities and the information needed to make informed decisions on behalf of their communities. So I think it's a good step. It's a good indicator of sort of where the administration looks to go should Vice President Biden be elected. And I also think that it's a very good sign that the vice presidential nominee Senator Kamala Harris has been the original Senate side sponsor of the Environmental Justice for All Act, and has been, sort of leading on a number of these policy fronts in a way that I think, hopefully will materialize into substantive administrative action should we see a new administration.
Thanks. Shooting it out to the rest of the panelists, Celina, Veronica, Nicky, Marianne. Thoughts on this plan from the Biden camp?
Yeah, so my initial thought was that activism is working, right? This was not a plan that kind of was part of the original Biden platform, and it has taken real advocacy for EJ to be at the table, and so was heartened to see a plan that reflects a lot of the EJ for all pieces that were put out in the bill, and the challenge now will be to sort of make sure that there is follow through, and so. And especially during a global pandemic that has shown all of the kind of holes in a federal governance system that does not serve Black and Brown communities. This should be a priority for a Biden administration should it be sworn in, and so hopefully some more kind of concrete commitments of when and how. I think there were a lot of really good policies laid out in the plan, but I think it should be something that happens within the first 100 days and should be something that they kind of lead with. So I'll be watching eagerly to see sort of what the implementation of this is. But I think the credit really does go to sort of the activism that has undergirded sort of bringing this to the fore in a way that we have not seen in previous presidential elections.
Thanks.
I'll defer to Nicky and Veronica if you want to go first.
No, go ahead, Mary. I was waiting for you all to go.
Okay. So I want to echo the theme that any approach must be accountable to communities. And so not only what drove this, but also once it unfolds, that element of public participation has to be front and center. So that's a piece that we need to look for. Any approach also has to prioritize funding and enforcement to those most affected, and the approach suggests that, just as the approach includes implementing Senator Booker's and Congressman Ruiz's EJ Environmental Justice Act of 2019, and calls it out specifically. And it says by executive action, whatever can be done by executive action should be done. Some of what's in that bill can be done by executive action, and some may not be able to. And so we'll have to see what happens there. There are, for example, amendments to the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act to ensure that cumulative impacts are taken into account. So a legislative agenda needs to put that front and center. Since Chris gave sort of an overview, and you can also find an overview online, what I'll do in my minute is to just focus in on my excitement to see overhauling civil rights compliance at EPA as a whole plank here, which is definitely unprecedented. And there are some important pieces there. So for those of you who haven't focused as much on this, EPA's civil rights enforcement has been poor. And that isn't to say that some work hasn't been done to make it better, and there aren't great people doing it, but it's been poor, and there are many reports that document that. And there are a number of key reasons, one of which is the conflation of civil rights standards with environmental standards. And the Biden platform calls that out and says, we're going to rescind the case like Steele, which was responsible for conflating standards. So that's really important. Calls for a guidance. It's pretty amazing that EPA has not had a programmatic guidance telling recipients of federal funds who are bound by the civil rights law what to do. So that's pretty important. So there's some really great stuff in here, including a fix for the case Sandoval that has prevented people from going to court with claims of an unjustified disparate impact. But I just wanted to say that there's also more that needs to be done. For example, moving the Office of Civil Rights, or it's called the External Civil Rights Compliance Office, to an enforcement location, OECA, rather than having it in the Office of General Counsel, which is conflicted. They defend the agency. And so that's a problem. Giving attorneys, having line attorneys who can enforce civil rights rather than deferring to the Office of General Counsel, using their affirmative compliance authority. They wait around passively until complaints come in. They do some technical assistance as well, but they have affirmative authority. So there's a lot more that can be done. Obviously, in a platform, you don't put all those details in, but the devil will be in the details. Let's see a major initiative to actually breathe some life into this law that people died for, and enforce it in the civil rights area to achieve racial justice.
Thank you, and that's an important point. You know, day by day, people are dying so that this legislation and bills like this can be passed and, you know, protect the future generations. So moving on to Nicky and Veronica.
Go ahead, Veronica.
Okay. I really don't have much to add. I absolutely agree 100% with my colleagues on the panel. I would say that the one thing that I could add to this conversation is that it's important not only to have community members at the table, but they really need to be driving policy. So some of the work that we're doing here in California, which maybe I'll talk a little bit more about later, really does have community members at the table at inception of putting policy together, so that they're not invited later after, you know, there's already some policy proposal. And so I think that it's really critical at the federal level as well to have community members at the table actively advising on policy from the very beginning of policy development.
Thank you.
So I'll just add quickly, and I'm not, you know, I'm not an expert on this. I must admit, I'm in my own world over here, you know, doing so much. I read it for the first time this morning. Everybody kept telling me about it. So I was pleasantly surprised. It was good. But I'm going to echo something that Marianne said. One thing that worried me a little bit, and, you know, kind of two areas I focus on a lot: cumulative impacts and requiring emission reductions in EJ communities. As Marianne said, it said, well, we're going to institute as much of the EJ, you know, 2019 Act as possible through executive order. But you won't be able to implement all that by executive order. And you wouldn't just want to implement it through executive order anyway, because we can't enforce, you know, outside government, we can't enforce executive orders. So the question is, you know, what happens to the part you can't implement by executive order? And as a long-term strategy, you don't just want to leave it to executive order. And in other parts, it would say, like, for like when cumulative impact, mention a tool, didn't mention a comprehensive policy. There's one in the bill from Senator Booker's office and the bill from Representative Graham and McKeachin's office. And I think I wanted to see more of a commitment to do the legislative part of that. And at parts, at times it said, you know, we will encourage the states or tell the states to prioritize emissions reduction in EJ communities. That's nice, but, you know, I'm still looking for more teeth there. How are you going to force them to do it through some kind of legislative process or rulemaking process? So good impressions, but, you know, a little bit more definitive statement of where the teeth are going to come from.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you all. So the next one, actually, Nikki, I'm gonna let you catch your breath while I read the question, because this one is gonna go to you because we're talking about New Jersey.
Okay.
So last month, New Jersey legislature passed S232, a bill that stipulates that the State Department of Environmental Protection would have to consider the impacts to overburdened communities, quote unquote, posed by certain new facilities, along with the expansions of those facilities or renewals of major source permits. What are some of the EJ policies that have been enacted at the state level that could serve as models across the country? And so New Jersey's killing it as of, this recent bill passing. Nikki, can you tell us more?
Yeah, I'm going to be like a politician. Since I don't know the answer to the question, I'm going to answer the question I do know the answer to. Like I say, a lot of times I'm on my own little world. I don't know the policies of other states well enough to critique them, either amening them or criticizing them. So I will say this. I think what we need, and I think what is unique about the law that's been passed in New Jersey, and I want to caution everybody, now we're going to go through a year, 18-month process of issuing the regulations, which are going to be just as important, if not more important, than the law itself. And you're going to hear me, and I read the question beforehand, so I'm a little bit prepared. This is going to be a common thing for me. What we need to have for EJ communities legislation nationally and statewide is we need programs, mechanisms that are going to actually deliver pollution reduction, right? We're going to have to go beyond laws that say, let's do a cumulative impact analysis. Let's consider cumulative impacts, or EJ, or laws that say, let's make a plan. I mean, sometimes, yeah, a plan for resiliency, maybe that is the final goal. But usually the final goal should not be to do an analysis, should not be to do a plan. It should be to actually have pollution reduction. And, I know that's difficult. So either the mechanism should be there, and we have the mechanism in this law, and I think that's what's unique about it. It actually says the permits shall be denied based on cumulative impacts. By the way, that's in the EJ for All Act, and that's in the act from Senator Booker's office too, that all this worked on. And that's what's unique about all those three. And that's the kind of language we need. I'll talk more about that later and let other people talk.
Sure. Celina, what are some other EJ policies that have been enacted at the state level that could be a model for kind of a national rollout?
Yeah, so I'm also going to answer in a bit of a politician way, which is to say that the New Jersey bill S232 is really quite remarkable and has been one of the things that my office, Senator Booker's office, has kind of been in communication with as we've been working on a bill that we just introduced, which is the Environmental Justice Legacy Cleanup Bill, which Nikki worked on and Marianne worked on and a number of other people worked on, but that really does take indicators kind of cumulative impact, and then not only says you cannot issue more permits in these overburdened communities, but you have 5 years to clean up your act, or else your permit is going to be revoked. And so again, that's kind of may seem like a slight difference, but I think is actually really meaningful, of sort of scaling back what already exists, because communities are already dying because of cumulative impacts, and the pollutant that we especially looked at was the air pollutant PM 2.5, which is just the size of the particle, which is extremely dangerous to human health because it can get past all of the lungs defenses. And there's been some great work that has been put out during the pandemic looking at the effect of this air pollutant on community health and then susceptibility to COVID and other respiratory diseases. So I would like to see kind of a bit more of that, but there is, I know Wilmington, Delaware passed a cumulative impact resolution. I believe that was last year, And so, you know, maybe not at kind of the state level, but I think that that speaks to, you know, the power that we're seeing kind of at the municipal level. And as far as I'm aware, only kind of a handful of a small handful of states have really sort of begun to amplify that to the state level. And certainly, you know, at the federal level, we have a bunch of really what I think good legislation that's been introduced, but our colleagues do not seem to be convinced that it's something worth passing. So again, I think that trickle upward is extremely important, and that looking kind of at the local level might even be more revealing.
Thanks. Other panelists?
Yeah, I guess I have a slightly different take on it. I think what I've seen over the last couple of years has been sort of this self-reinforcing momentum where, you know, EJ advocates have been leading the charge in Congress to advance comprehensive EJ legislation. And those same advocates or allies and networks with which they work have taken that momentum and those policy prescriptions to the state level as well, either to, you know, bolster existing advocacy or to start new conversations around, you know, cumulative impacts, for example. So all of that is to say, I think that's why it's so important that as we in Congress, but also state legislatures and governors look at how they pursue addressing environmental justice, that the public input component be central to that effort. Because that's sort of, from my vantage point, how that self-reinforcing momentum was developed. And that was really, really exciting to see. You know, I don't think that for some of these major policy frameworks, that there's just one solution. And Celina's kind of alluded to this in her comments before, but Senator Booker has introduced a really strong piece of legislation that in some respects deals with aspects of environmental justice that the EJ for All Act does not address, particularly around legacy pollution cleanup. And so, but it also has, you know, its slightly different approach to addressing cumulative impacts. The Clean Future Act that was in the Energy and Commerce Committee also had a different approach to addressing cumulative impacts, which essentially was to mandate that states develop their own cumulative impact strategies. So all of that is coming from the community in a very clear sense, and I think legislators are reacting to that to the extent that they have those mechanisms to intake input directly from the community. And that trickles down and up at the federal level, but also at the state legislative level, and even among municipalities.
I'll jump in. I put in the chat a report from NRDC on local EJ policies that might be useful. And there's an older report that was affiliated with the Hastings Law Journal that was a survey of earlier state EJ policies. That's good background. I'm working with a consortium of groups, Conservation Law Foundation, UT Austin, American University and Hastings to redo that study and make it available to the public, because there's been such an explosion of EJ laws and policies at the state level. Nicky talked about emissions reduction, so I won't focus on that. The first generation of EJ laws were really about process. I think about Connecticut's EJ law, which is 11 years old now, that required community consultation for the siting of certain kinds of polluting facilities. And while perhaps it slowed down putting those facilities in the same overburdened communities of color and low-income communities, perhaps, we don't really know. You can't do the counterfactual. It required a certain amount of consultation, and voice is really important. And it also allows for community benefits agreements. So some communities were able to get something as a result of that process, and also perhaps it prevented some facilities from going in communities, but it really can't be credited with emissions reduction. I think the more recent generation of laws, and there just have been a lot, we really have to think about. We're going to talk about mapping tools in a few minutes, but California, CalEnviroscreen, Washington State, 22 states have mapping tools in the health area that can be expanded like Washington State did to create a visual representation of which communities are most impacted, which can then be used in policy as they are in California. Environmental justice advisory boards, sometimes they may be not meaningful. Sometimes they may be more meaningful as a place where people can have voice and require input, as well as New York State has a new set of advisory panels that actually have rulemaking and subpoena power. So environmental justice advisory boards are an area to look at. And I say environmental justice, some of these are growing up in the context of climate justice. Language access laws to ensure that all people can participate, and that processes like permit processes are accessible to people with other languages. Public participation requirements, whether in the NEPA or Little NEPA context. Civil rights enforcement, California and Illinois, you can actually go to court to enforce claims of an unjustified disparate impact. Health equity assessments, many states have health equity assessment provisions which require an assessment with an equity lens. Equity in climate planning, and I'll stop here, but I think it's really important to have environmental justice in the climate justice context on the table. In Connecticut, I'm on the I co-chair the Equity and Environmental Justice Working Group of the Governor's Council on Climate Change. And we're charged with coming up with solutions. The Governor's Executive Order 3, which launched the GC3, the Governor's Council on Climate Change, which is one of many efforts across the state at the state and local level to create climate action plans. Executive Order 3 required that mitigation and adaptation strategies be evaluated for their impact on vulnerable populations and communities of color and low-income communities. So there, and then you think about how that then proliferates into transportation equity, thinking about solar for rentals and not just for homeowners. There's just so much going on. Frankly, it's exciting, it's time-consuming, and there are a lot of models out there.
I'll just add very quickly a couple of things. So in California in 2017, the legislature passed a bill called Assembly Bill 617, also known as AB 617. It's an air quality bill, requires addressing granular air pollution in the state's most heavily overburdened communities. And so a couple of things there that are challenges with that bill. One is that a lot of local air pollution is outside of the control of the local air districts. So for example, West Oakland, which is a heavily overburdened community, some of the biggest emission sources are freeways, highways. Some of the sources are local truck routes, some are from the Port of Oakland. And so one of the challenges is within the framework of air quality regulation, how do we get the city of Oakland to come to the table or the Port of Oakland to come to the table when there's not a legal mandate for them to do that? And then the other thing that is kind of surfaced in implementing this law, and certainly since I've been at the Air District for 2 months now, is, I really wanted to explore having a moratorium on permitting in areas that have been designated as AB 617 communities. And what I have found thus far is that the Bay Area Air Quality Management District does not have the legal authority to not permit. So if a new facility meets certain criteria, we're required to issue the permit. So, you know, if you're looking at East Oakland, which has a lot of industrial sources, on the first community meeting that we had for AB 617 back in 2017, we permitted a crematorium on that very day that we were in this community meeting. So one of the things that I'm interested in exploring within the Air District, but also with EJ lawyers who are working really hard on this program, is how do we affect or have a moratorium on permitting so that these overburdened communities are not going to continue to get new sources or re-permit sources as we work really hard to reduce emissions and exposures in those communities.
Thank you. Swinging over from one end of the country to the other now, talking since we are kind of on the California tip now, California SB 1000 ensures that environmental justice concerns are taken into account for all general plans for land use across the state. What was the impetus for this bill, and what were the conditions that allowed for such a strong EJ bill like this to pass in California? What lessons can other states learn? So I'll start with Celina and then go to Veronica.
Yeah, I have a lot less to say on this, so I'll be eager to hear others' responses. But this, I think, serves as kind of a good model for what we were talking about earlier, of not just sort of, you know, screening to understand where cumulative impacts are, but then like requiring municipalities to put in actionable plans on a short time frame, right? None of this kind of like by 2050. So that I think is kind of one thing that sticks out to me about the bill, as kind of being a good model for some of this other legislation. And kind of, you know, California has also done a bit of a better job of putting, you know, funding behind some of these legislative initiatives. Again, not as much as is required, but I think that is another kind of crucial point, right? Is that there can be changes kind of in federal policymaking, but ultimately there has to be the funding for community groups that are doing this work often unpaid, and for advocates that are, again, often doing this work unpaid and understaffed. So I think that's kind of an area for growth, but it's good to see sort of like, you know, feet to the fire approach.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I'll just jump in. I think I moved to California in 2017 as SB 1000 was probably, I can't remember exactly when it was passed, but, you know, within the last 4 years or so. So I wasn't around for all of the advocacy that went on as a basis or for SB 1000, but basically SB 1000 requires that where local governments are revising at least 2 elements of their general plan, then they have to do an EJ element. So a couple of things I can say is that there is a lot of really effective EJ advocacy in California. So for example, the California Environmental Justice Alliance has been very active in Sacramento and getting legislation passed. And they've actually, you know, emerged as a leader on SB 1000, putting together a toolkit for communities that are enforcing SB 1000 and where they're working on these EJ elements. One key thing about California is that And I lived here many years ago, where I went to undergraduate and law school and then moved away for 20 years. And in that time that I was away, California did a number of really interesting things. First of all, yes, it is a very blue state. It wasn't always, but it is now. And we have term limits. So those term limits ensure that, you know, there's a constant pool of new people. And fortunately, right now, new, more progressive people are taking public office. I mentioned the California Environmental Justice Alliance. Some of their staff, some of their member organizations, leadership have run for political office. So, for example, in, I want to say San Bernardino County or Riverside County, there was a woman who headed up an EJ organization who ran for the Board of Supervisors. In Sacramento at the California Environmental Justice Alliance, there's a woman by the name of Katie Valenzuela, who is a really, you know, has been doing EJ activism for her entire career, and she was just elected to the Sacramento City Council. So you also have, because of term limits, this opportunity for EJ leaders to run for public office, and that's been really effective in getting really strong progressive laws in place.
Excellent. Chris. Oh, you're muted.
I was leave the mute on. I'm not sure I have much to add other than, you know, just from my own experience growing up in California. And, you know, much of what drove my advocacy at that time was fights over land use planning and affordable housing. And so I think this represents a good step in sort of bringing environmental justice issues to the fore and under consideration by municipalities as they undertake that process. Because, I mean, clearly there is a strong connection between land use and housing policy and outcomes in public health and with respect to environmental justice. I know Ms. Ocasio-Cortez has been doing a lot of work around that front, really trying to drive solutions to that challenge through policy. So I think it's a good step. And as we've discussed before, you know, the more models that are out there for policymakers at all levels to consider, the better the product is going to be when we're able to pass meaningful environmental justice legislation.
Excellent. Marianne.
First, I put the link to the toolkit that Veronica mentioned in the chat, if anybody wants to take a look at it. And it starts with the following sentence: a history of poor and discriminatory land use practices has put the majority of polluting industries in the backyards of the most disenfranchised local communities, right next to homes and schools. And maybe it goes without saying that we're having this conversation because the history of segregation and discrimination is baked racial inequalities in where health hazards are located, and racial inequality in who's exposed to health hazards into land use that we experience today. And even if all decisions were equal today, which they are not, they are based on zoning laws, land use that comes with a history, comes with a legacy. I think about New York City, where we had a Board of Estimates that was ruled unconstitutional. The Board of Estimates made land use decisions, and they decided which areas were industrial zoned and which areas were residential zoned, and therefore where polluting facilities go. That Board of Estimates was ruled unconstitutional in the 1980s, but nobody uprooted all their decisions because they were based on discrimination, based on decision-making where people of color were underrepresented. And that's true all across the country, that it's baked into land use. A good resource is also Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, which describes some of this as well, or Dorsita Taylor's writing. And so I think we need to be intentional and intentional about race and discrimination on the basis of national origin in every step of decision making. This law deals with planning. And then from planning forms the basis of permitting and concrete decisions. And so we need to be intentional in permitting. And then we need to be intentional once permits are granted and facilities operate in enforcement. And all of that requires intentionality and public participation. So, so this fits into an understanding, or the basis for it is an understanding of how land use and discrimination land use is baked into our system, and how we need to be very conscious about the role race and national origin discrimination plays in the way we use land, and the built and natural environment, who has access to environmental goods, who suffers from environmental harms. And then we need to address it at each stage: the planning, the implementation, the enforcement.
Excellent. Thank you. And then, yeah, so, and I noticed that some of the other panelists have dropped some other resources. Feel free to do that. We're going to compile all of the links that are shared throughout the sessions, throughout the conference, and put them in a single document, organized by session, so that attendees and anyone else can have access to those. Nicky, do you want to say a last word on this question?
Yeah, I've been, let me say, I should have said it last time, but I know it's your question, what are the conditions? So, so let me just, and Chris talked about this a little bit. I have a feeling the conditions are probably similar in California than they are in New Jersey. And so let me just say this. In New Jersey, you know, with respect to cumulative impacts and emissions reductions, right? We formed the New Jersey EJ Alliance in 2003. And we were working with communities focusing on local air pollution. And they would, you know, come to us about incinerators, right? Sewage plants, diesel pollution, right? All these things. And so it became obvious to us that local air pollution was a problem for EJ communities. So we started developing policy around that, right? We started developing policy because that's what the communities were coming to us for. Right? So we started talking about cumulative impacts, you know, and made the decision that we had to talk about cumulative impacts way back in 2007. By 2011, we had our statewide cumulative impacts policy, and we had a municipal ordinance already written. Marianne was part of a group of New Jersey EJ attorneys we started that actually counseled us on the municipal ordinance. I don't know if you remember that, Marianne. And so we had it, nobody was listening, right? I remember putting our statewide cumulative impacts policy in comments to EPA, I don't know, back in 2012, 2013, right? So, you know, so that work had been done a lot. And then kind of what happened when Senator Booker, right, came with the EJ law and came to us in New Jersey, it didn't have cumulative impact in it, but we were ready. We said, well, look, EJ bill, you got cumulative impacts in it. And we gave them the statewide policy, and a variation of that was put in there. And the latest version looks very much like our statewide policy. Well, what was the difference? Senator Booker was willing to listen. You know, he was willing to listen and put it in legislation. And then Representatives Grijalva and McEachin were willing to listen and do the same thing. And I think all that work in between was the EJ community, and I said this for a long time. Our greatest achievement for a very long time was moving EJ policies and just EJ discussions from the margins to the mainstream of policy discussions. But we were getting very frustrated because we couldn't get the policy victories, right? People were talking and we had these policies, but we couldn't get the policy victories. I was on NEJAC for years and they got tired of me because I would raise my hand and say, the tool's not enough, you know? And they started to know what I was gonna say. So when I raised my hand, they would say, oh, we gotta get the, you know? And you know, and I think over that time, and it taught me a lesson, right? We were at this for a dozen years before we have people in the legislatures, God bless them, and were willing to say, oh, you all are not crazy, right? These, you know, we can actually put these, and that really, what Chris was saying before, so it kind of came from the state to the national. When the national folks, you know, we had a sitting senator saying, oh yeah, you can turn down cumulative impacts. You can turn down permits based on cumulative impacts, and then the House follows. That gives us legitimacy. It's not us crazy EJ folk anymore, and Marianne counseling us, and Veronica doing her thing, right? But now we have senators and representatives saying this, and it came back to the state level then. You know, for New Jersey, hey, Senator Booker's our senator. So, you know, New Jersey legislators are gonna, but you know what the lesson it taught me? That it took 12 or 13 years.
Right.
And I didn't think it was gonna happen. I was sure I was gonna die and this stuff was not gonna happen. You know, I'm passing it on to other people, and I'd done my little part. But, you know, it's told me you gotta be patient to some degree. You gotta keep fighting, and you just never know when it's gonna happen. And let's also call out Black Lives Matter, right? Which now is setting setting the table. And let's get as much done as we can now, because there may be a different table, you know, coming up. So all of that came together in the convergence of that.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely correct.
I'm sorry, I got too excited there.
No, that's perfect. That's exactly that's the real deal.
And I'm trying to write all this down. I've promised this for years. That's I know you all tired of hearing it, but we're trying.
So we're at 2 o'clock now, and we've got about 25 minutes left in this session, and we want to give at least 10 minutes for Q&A with the audience. So, and if I look a little distracted, it's because I'm adding people from the wait list into the room. So moving on to the next question, a few panelists have mentioned tools and EJ screening. So this question is about EJ screening. And also, I think we have Charles Lee on the call in the audience, who is a huge advocate and environmental justice legend when it comes to these tools and spatial EJ. So with these environmental justice mapping tools that get at these cumulative impacts and comparing one area to another in terms of these impacts, what experiences do you have with these mapping tools? How would you aim to improve these tools if you've used them before? How would you aim to improve them for policymaker use and also for community use? And how can we make them more accessible to policymakers and understandable and translatable to policymakers? And I'll start with Veronica on this one.
Great. I was about to unmute myself. So you heard Marianne mention CalEnviroScreen, and CalEnviroScreen is a pollution mapping tool. It has 20 indicators. 10 of them are related to the pollution burden, and the other 10 are social factors like linguistic isolation, education, things of that sort. So CalEnviroScreen was created for basically distribution of funding that came out of California's cap and trade program. I won't go into that because we could spend another hour talking about California cap and trade. But anyway, CalEnviroScreen is the framework that defines disadvantaged communities. And it's actually, although being started for the distribution of funding, has many, many other uses. So, I mentioned, for example, Assembly Bill 617. And when that bill was passed, I was working at the California Air Resources Board, and CARB was sanctioned with creating the framework for AB 617. And first and foremost, identifying the most heavily air pollution burdened, who would be the highest priority for us to be working in. So it was a really important tool for that. However, that said, California is a very diverse state in many ways, including in income and cost of living. And so one of the challenges was that as we were, you know, doing runs of CalEnviroScreen and trying to figure out where the most overburdened census tracts were, it was, I think, number 250 or somewhere in that range before we even got to a census tract in the Bay Area. So as you can imagine, really expensive areas of California are hard to identify. I mean, obviously, there are some really overburdened communities in the Bay Area. So that was one of the issues. Another issue is that it also is a challenge to identify rural communities. We had problems with it at the California-Mexico border because when it was first put together, there was no pollution on the Mexican side of the border that was quantified and included in CalEnviroScreen. So it took a number of iterations, and in the case of Mexico, working with researchers on the Mexican side of the border so that we could quantify that pollution. So it definitely has had its challenge. I think we're on CalEnviroScreen 3.0 right now, and it continues to be updated by California's Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, which is responsible for developing CalEnviroScreen. So I will stop there, and I'll just say that yes, it is very important. And with respect to 8617, what we decided to do in using CalEnviroScreen as well as many other factors was to look at it regionally. And that's the only way that we were able to identify census tracts in the Bay Area. Oh, and one final thing I will say is that race is not one of the factors in CalEnviroScreen. It's I think unfortunate and surprising, but at the time that it was put together, I think the Attorney General's office weighed in and precluded the state from including race as a factor. OEHA, the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, has done a lot of work to be able to get around the race factor. And so I do feel like race is probably reflected and it's effective, but you know, as we change as a state and as a country, and as our policy priorities change, and as we turn towards environmental racism and racial equity more broadly, it's my hope that, you know, we will be able to proactively put that race as a factor, or at least do the legwork to see what the differences are when you do incorporate race. CARB, before CalEnviroScreen was put together, created its own tool called the Environmental Justice Screening Method, which was later replaced by CalEnviroScreen. But that tool, EJSM, we still use it to a certain degree, and that does actually consider race. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. Marianne?
Yeah, and I think the two caveats to the importance of mapping tools are, one, as Nicky has emphasized, we want to have emissions reduction, and it's the use of the tool that can help with emissions reduction. It's not the tool itself, so let's not confuse the instrument with the end. And then secondly, we don't want to just study disparities. I know a lot of people are very frustrated. We're studying, we know there are disparities, let's do something about them. With those caveats in mind, though, I agree with Veronica. I think they're critical. I'm hoping Charles will put his article, Charles Lee, who's will put his article in the chat, otherwise I can later. But I think the visual representation of the cumulative impacts of multiple sources of pollution, I mean, let me go back and say what these mapping tools allow us to do is to make manageable what some people have sort of historically thrown their hands up. When communities say, our community is overburdened by the cumulative impacts of poverty and multiple sources of pollution and legacy sites, applicants often say, well, how do we take all that into account? And applicants for permits and policymakers say, oh, it's unmanageable. And the excitement now of having data sets that can be overlaid and visually represented with the social determinants of health, those conditions that relate to where we live, work, play, go to school, go to church, that affect our health. Those are poverty and race and language and whether you have a job and whether you have access to healthcare. Those social determinants of health overlaid with where are their environmental hazards, where are their legacy sites, overlaid with what we know about health outcomes, where are their cancer rates that are already high, where are their asthma rates that are already high, now where are their COVID rates that are high, overlaid now with climate, where are the heat zones, where are the flood zones. Then you can use that in policy to rank. These are the most affected communities for climate change. You don't even have to have just one index. And even if race isn't in a particular index, it's in the database. So communities can use the data to make the argument about civil rights enforcement, make an argument about where enforcement should be located. So that's why these are so critical, that they overlay demographic information, health information, environmental information, and climate information. While it's helpful to have a federal mapping tool, state mapping tools are so important because the federal mapping tool, while it's open source and you can add to it, it's only got federal data. And states have so much more data. You can get so much more granular. So CalEnviroScreen and Washington State's disparities mapping tool really allow you to dig in. And with data becoming more and more available, they'll allow us to dig in even more to understand where the relative hotspots in a state that can then be used to, as Veronica was saying, to target resources. What makes them more effective? First of all, they have to have input from communities. Front and centered in Washington State and the civil rights, the Environmental Justice Coalition in California did outreach, and they got funding for outreach to get information about what is most important in the state. Second of all, they need to have sort of a beta test to see if they're usable or where are their glitches, and to train people to use them so applicants can use them in their permitting process, so decision makers can use them, and so communities can use them in making their arguments. So there needs to be some funding for the participation side of this, and then they need to have certain functionality. Veronica mentioned the index that allows us to compare communities or compare census block groups. In addition, there's functionality of, for example, if you have a permit, drawing a radius around the permit and look at who's affected and what the racial characteristics or other social determinants of health are in that community versus the county or the state as a whole. So there's some functionality that's needed, but it's a very exciting area which really allows us to build consensus around which are the most vulnerable communities and where should enforcement resources, planning resources be targeted.
Thanks, Marianne. And really, I'll have to force the last few panelists to do really quick lightning round responses to this question so we can get over to the Q&A.
Yeah, so I'll just quickly add in, as part of Chairman Grijalva's Environmental Justice Initiative, he had throughout the process a working group of advisors to look at some of these different aspects of EJ policy, and the screening tools was an area where we had several conversations around. I think there are two things to keep in consideration when talking about screening tools. The first is, what is its purpose, right? So in that context, you know, a lot of the conversation was, is this a public information tool that's designed for EJ communities to use to sort of map strategies and impact, as Marianne was describing? Or is this sort of an automatic triggering mechanism for resources and capacity and programming in EJ communities? And so for that latter part of the conversation, I really do think that it's important to look at all of the state mapping tools that are available, look at the data sources that are used, and really think through all that before baking a tool into a piece of legislation that acts as an automatic triggering mechanism. Now that said, you know, as all of the panelists have indicated, a screening tool is essential for a lot of reasons. And so while we left the triggering mechanisms off of the EJ for All Act, we did include in the legislation a mandate for a screening tool like EPA's EJ Screen.
Thanks. Celina and Nicky?
Celina, do you want to go?
Go for it.
I'm conflicted about this. I'm going to tell you the truth. And this comes from a person who starts off almost every presentation I ever give. I show the screening tool from New Jersey, and race is not incorporated into it, but they graph race against their scores, cumulative impact scores of communities. And I love it, and I show it every time, you know, because I think it's great visually. But, and I've said this before, you know, I think the policies drive the tool should not drive the policy. The tool should be a means of policy, right, to help implement a policy. And I'm just always fearful, don't get caught up, don't get paralyzed by the tool. When we first started this in New Jersey, I don't know if you all know Dr. Peter Montague. Peter and I were going around trying to figure out all the data that needed to go into a screening tool. Didn't have one. And we finally came to the conclusion, if we just use race and income, we would be cool, because that represents everything else. Now, that's not what happens, because, you know, I almost view a tool almost as a political tool to convince people this needs to get done. And it can help you with the nuances of policy also. But again, the tool has to be used by a policy to get the admissions reductions. And we know we can do this now. We have multiple tools around the country. So pick one, get it done, but get that policy in place and use the tool in that way, as everybody's saying, to convince folks this needs to get done, and, you know, to have a tool that helps to implement a policy.
Thanks.
Yeah, so really, really briefly, one of the challenges I've come across in using EJ Screen for the legacy pollution cleanup bill was just that a lot of the data is not updated fairly frequently, and in part just because there isn't, you know, funding or infrastructure to do this, and also in part because communities are not given the tools with which to collect data that then can be sort of mapped on these larger tools. And so in that way, it is kind of very centralized in a way that makes it, I think, less useful than it can be. But to echo kind of what Nicky was saying, the most useful piece of that tool has been to show others in other offices in the Senate, like, look, here are the problems. Here are, you know, some colors that represent these problems, ranging from, you know, gray to red in severity. And that being a communication tool rather than kind of, you know, vice versa, the tool driving the policy.
Thanks. And we actually, I have to give a hub plug. You know, in our lab, we have developed the Maryland Environmental Justice Screening Tool, but we're facing these same questions and these same kind of challenges and issues, and making it a useful community-driven tool that policymakers will incorporate into action. So with that, I did have one more question kind of regarding general challenges. So maybe panelists, I'll ask you to kind of think about that, but I do want to open up the room for questions. And I know that we've had a few posted in the chat. This is where the the cell phone interface for Zoom is really going to skewer me. So what I can do, I see that Vincent Martin has a hand raised. So Vincent, do you want to turn your microphone on and ask your question?
Okay, thank you for great discussion. I wish there was a way that we could utilize these tools to show the inequities in resource distribution, because that's the biggest problem, because resources are not getting to communities where they need to be. It's usually being siphoned. By the time it gets there, all you have left is crumbs. So how can we use these tools to show how benefits and resources are being distributed to communities? I yield. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Any response from the panelists?
Yeah, I'll just jump in. So Callan Virus Screen, since it was created to distribute cap and trade funding, and there are a couple of bills that actually require that a minimum of 35% of cap and trade funding go to communities of color and low-income communities or disadvantaged communities as defined by Callan Virus Screen. There is a really, you know, it's ready and very useful in tracking financial resources. That doesn't necessarily mean resources in terms of enforcement and things like that, but it does provide a good foundation for that. In California, CARB is also required to report annually on its distribution of funding, and regular legislative hearings. As I said, you know, our legislatures are pretty progressive. So there's also on a regular basis, CARB and other agencies, including my own, who are hauled in to be made accountable and report to the legislature on distribution of resources, funding, enforcement in disadvantaged communities.
I would just add really quickly that that Michigan is also developing a tool. The University of Michigan has folks working on a tool, and that it can be a tool for communities. I mean, there often is not consensus around. I mean, we may know which are the most disadvantaged communities. Vincent, you've been arguing for decades. You know, it's obvious which are the most disadvantaged communities in some ways. But when we can agree on an index, or when you can map this, it becomes even more compelling to really show where there are the health problems, or where there are the facilities, and what that relationship is, and what the relationship is to race. So I think the intent is to use it precisely how you like it.
You know, I wanted to add, Vince, there are several reports talking about the disparity in resources. They didn't necessarily use a tool. I can't remember the methodology. Ana Baptista did one recently, the reports before that. So those kind of reports are out there. They didn't necessarily use tools, but, you know, but they do talk about the disparities in resources.
Thank you.
And so there are two more questions that I want to get to in the chat. One deals with the general or maybe specific lack of political will in kind of meting out environmental justice at the state and federal level. So I'll allow, I think that was, and of course the screen went away. That was Fatma Shafle, sorry, at Spelman College. What about the lack of political will? So just in general,
that's been the main problem. I mean, that, you know, the main problem has been historically not that we didn't know communities needed help. We've known that, but the main problem has been the political will to get it done. I say for years we had policies, we were doing the advocacy, but you know, the government didn't want to spend the political capital to make make changes. And look, we know we're asking for a lot, but if you want a just society, you need to do it. And that goes back to where we are now. You know, it took years to set that up. And I think we're at a moment where hopefully will last, but we'll see. And I gotta say, I've been surprised by how things are moving now, and grateful too, I will say right now. And I just, you know, let's see how far we can go.
Excellent, thank you. Other panelists want to comment on the lack of political will? How we overcome it?
I'll just give another shout out to Black Lives Matter. I mean, it's tragic that the nation as a whole has to experience on videotape, you know, the death of George Floyd and watch racial disparities in COVID to somehow lock in. And I say the nation as a whole, it's not the nation as a whole. Some parts of the nation are locking in on how unfair and discriminatory our society is. But change starts from, and the political will starts from people demanding that change. And EJ groups have been demanding change for a very long time. And then, as Nicky was describing before, it's important to seize the moment when there is, we sort of get above the fold or onto the news, and you can develop that momentum. And I think that's part of being ready, as Nicky described, and then moving forward on what needs to be done is really important.
Yeah, and more EJ leaders need to run for public office. I mentioned a couple of people who ran for public office, but I also forgot there's somebody named Nori Martinez in LA, and she ran an EJ group called Pacoima Beautiful. She's now president of LA City Council. So we need to get our people into office.
Absolutely. I know we're 2 minutes over time now, and the next meeting does start at 2:30. So at this point, I want to thank all of our panelists in this room. Since you can engage, I encourage everyone to turn on their mics and give a round of applause. Thank you very, very much to each of our panelists. Does everyone know how to get to their next session? There are 2 concurrent sessions.